A July morning. The air already has weight before the sun clears the tree line. You walk up to the hive, the one that was drawing comb through June, the one whose supers were getting heavier every week, and you see them, bees clustered at the entrance, a thick mass on the landing board, some fanning, some pressed against the front of the box. The instinct comes fast, the same instinct most beekeepers develop after their first or second summer. It's hot, they're bearding, maybe prop the inner cover, give them a little more air, and then move on. That explanation isn't wrong, but it isn't complete. And the part it leaves out has been costing beekeepers winter colonies for as long as they've been reading July hives through the lens of heat management. There is a detail in how those bees position themselves at the entrance, in their age, in their orientation, in the specific hours when the clustering is heaviest, that most beekeepers look directly at and see nothing. That detail is the colony telling you something about its internal state that the frames won't confirm clearly for another 3 weeks. By then, the window to respond has usually closed. If you've walked up to a July hive, seen bees at the entrance, and moved on, this might be worth staying for. If this kind of observation-first approach to colony reading is useful to you, a like on this video helps it reach other beekeepers who might need it. The habit of reading the entrance before opening the hive has roots in American beekeeping that go deeper than most contemporary management guidance acknowledges. In the commercial apiaries of Ohio and Indiana through the late 19th and early 20th century, beekeepers managing dozens of colonies had developed what some described as an entrance-first practice. Before the hive tool came out, before the smoker was worked, they stood and watched. Not long, a minute, sometimes less, but they were looking for specific things, and they had learned that what the entrance showed them shaped what they were going to find when they opened the colony. Moses Quinby described the entrance as the colony's most honest indicator. Early editions of the ABC and XYZ noted that experienced practitioners consistently developed the habit of reading the entrance before reaching for the hive tool. The entrance was the first chapter of the colony's story. The frames were the second. That habit largely disappeared as frame inspection became the dominant diagnostic method through the mid-20th century. The frame became primary. The entrance became secondary. A glance on the way to pulling on your veil rather than something you actually read before doing anything else. And with that shift, a layer of observational knowledge that the old commercial beekeepers had refined across decades of seasonal work stopped being transmitted. What remained was the instinct to see bees at the entrance and reach immediately for a ventilation explanation. July is where that explanation breaks down most completely. But here's the problem with that explanation. In May and June, bees at the entrance in the morning hours almost always mean one of two things. Pre-swarm forager idling, the signal that a colony is approaching swarm preparation, or normal activity during peak population buildup. Both of those belong to the colony's expansionary phase, when everything it is doing biologically is oriented toward growth and reproduction. July is not an expansionary phase. July is the turning point. Nais amba al. In most of the temperate American beekeeping belt, the primary nectar flow ends somewhere between late June and mid-July. The clover finishes. The basewood is past. The summer forage closes down within the space of 2 or 3 weeks, usually without any dramatic signal that would catch a beekeeper's attention on a calendar. But the colony feels that shift before the beekeeper sees it. It feels it in the weight of incoming nectar, in the foragers returning with lighter loads, in the ratio between full cells and empty cells changing in a direction the colony's biology reads as significant. The colony begins reorganizing its behavior around that reading before most beekeepers have updated their seasonal expectations. The bees at the entrance in July are part of that reorganization. But what looks uniform from 10 feet away is actually several distinct signals arriving simultaneously. And telling them apart starts with one question: the age of those bees. And Arvand fru aids you. And Master Basso, son bulsko bow. The age of those bees. A forager bee is visibly different from a house bee if you know what to look for. She is darker, her cuticle has hardened across weeks of flight exposure. Her wings show wear at the trailing edge, fraying at the margins in a way that new wings never do. She holds herself differently on the landing board, upright, alert, oriented outward. A young bee, a nurse bee, a bee that hasn't yet transitioned out of her internal hive phase, is lighter in colour, softer in her movement, less purposefully directed in how she rests. In July, look at the bees accumulated at the entrance in the morning hours, between sunrise and mid-morning, and ask one question before any other. Are these forager age bees, or are these young bees, the age of those bees? That's the thing that changes everything. If the clustering is predominantly young bees, that's a population density signal. The colony may have more bees than its internal space is managing comfortably. That is a different conversation about equipment and configuration, but if the clustering is predominantly forager age bees, darker, worn-winged, stationed at the entrance in a posture of outward orientation rather than hanging loose on the exterior, in the distributed, gravity-responsive clusters of true heat-bearding, that is the signal, and it means something specific. Forager age bees clustered at the entrance in morning hours, when those bees should under normal summer conditions be departing actively for the field, means one thing with high reliability: the colony's departure drive is suppressed. In July, the primary cause of that suppression is dearth onset. The nectar that was sending recruitment signals through the colony in June, that was pulling bees out of the hive before 8 in the morning, is gone or nearly gone. The foragers exist, their biology is intact, their motivation is intact, but the signal that should be launching them into the field isn't coming with sufficient force, so they accumulate at the entrance, oriented outward, in the posture of bees waiting for a cue that isn't coming. This is where July is completely different from any other month in the beekeeping calendar. This is where the ventilation explanation begins to fail. Heat bearding is a thermoregulation response. The colony is moving body heat outside the box. Bees in true heat bearding distribute themselves loosely across the exterior, on the bottom board, on the sides, hanging in relaxed gravity-responsive clusters. They are not particularly oriented. They are not stationed. They are spread, cooling. July dearth clustering concentrates at the entrance. The bees are oriented outward. They are forager age. They are not hanging. They are waiting. That is a suppression signal, not a ventilation signal. And the response it calls for is not a top entrance. The distinction matters because the two conditions require opposite management. A thermoregulation problem benefits from additional airflow. A dearth onset is asking for something else entirely, because dearth onset and robbing season are not two separate events. They are the same phenomenon observed from two different angles. The dearth that suppressed your foragers this morning suppressed every colony's foragers in the surrounding area. Operations that were collecting nectar productively 2 weeks ago now have large forager populations with no local surplus to exploit, and full biological motivation to find one. Colonies with entrances larger than their guard force can reliably defend become targets. A hive entrance that worked fine during the June flow, when every colony was occupied with incoming nectar and robbing pressure was minimal, becomes a liability in July when that arithmetic inverts. Watch the perimeter of the entrance in July, not the center of the landing board, the edges, the corners. Are there bees positioned there that behave differently from the clustered foragers in the middle? Bees that intercept incoming foragers more aggressively, that probe along the box joints, that hover just outside the entrance in a searching pattern rather than a direct landing approach? That is the beginning of robbing scouting. It may be coming from other hives in your own apiary, or from colonies in the surrounding area. Either way, it arrives alongside dearth onset because dearth and robbing season are the same event. The beekeeper who sees July clustering assumes heat, opens the inner cover and walks away has responded to the wrong message. They've made the colony easier to probe at precisely the moment when probe pressure is building. If this kind of observation-based colony reading is changing how you're thinking about summer management, it might be worth subscribing. There's more of this ahead, but there is a third layer to what July entrance behavior is communicating. And this one carries the most weight. In a colony with normal summer Varroa progression, July is when the mite population enters its steepest growth curve of the year. Through May and June, with brood rearing active and the forager population building, Varroa has been reproducing at a steady rate. July changes the arithmetic. The adult bee population is near its annual maximum. The brood nest is still heavily capped, and the colony has begun its shift toward late summer brood rearing, producing not the summer forager cohort, but the bees whose physiological condition will determine whether the winter cluster survives February. The mite's accelerating in those capped cells right now. They're not building a summer problem. The mite reproducing in a July brood cell is not reproducing in a summer bee whose shortened lifespan is inconsequential to the colony's February survival. She is reproducing in a bee that will, if her physiology is intact, become a winter bee, a bee with high vitellogenin concentration, enlarged fat body, cold tolerance measured not in weeks but in months. The viral load a mite carries into that bee's fat body tissue during her nurse phase degrades precisely the physiological structures that winter bee quality depends on. The connection runs directly. From a July capped cell to an October adult bee with compromised fat body physiology, to a February cluster that cannot sustain its thermal mass through a cold week in late winter. The dead-out that most beekeepers will open in March. The box with honey remaining and a small cluster that stopped somewhere in February often traces its origin not to what happened in October or November, but to what was building inside those July brood cells while the foragers were clustered at the entrance 3 months earlier. The clustering at the entrance in July is visible. The Varroa population accelerating inside those capped cells is not. They are happening at the same time in the same colony. Simultaneously and invisibly. There is one more signal that July entrance behavior sometimes carries, and it is the most precise seasonal timing marker the colony offers. Drone eviction. Workers actively dragging or pushing drones toward the entrance opening. When drone eviction begins at the July entrance, the colony has crossed a biological threshold in its own internal assessment of the season. The caloric cost of maintaining a drone population is no longer justified against its forage expectation. The colony has concluded that the expansionary phase is over. That is not a distress signal. It is a precision signal. The colony's assessment of the season's turning point is typically more accurate than the beekeeper's calendar. Drone eviction in early July means the autumn transition has begun from the inside out. The colony is preparing before the beekeeper has started thinking about preparation. The beekeeper who understands this is working with the colony's biology. The one who misses it is working 3 weeks behind it. The practical sequence that emerges from reading the July entrance correctly follows the logic of the signals themselves. First, the observation. For 2 or 3 consecutive mornings in early to mid-July, between sunrise and 10 o'clock, stand at the entrance for 2 or 3 minutes before opening anything. Look at the age of the bees on the landing board. Look at their orientation, stationed and outward facing, or distributed and loose. Check the perimeter edges for probing behavior distinct from the main cluster. Note whether drone eviction is visible. 2 or 3 mornings of this, with consistent flying weather, give you a reading that no single frame inspection on any one of those days produces with the same clarity. The entrance tells you what the colony is experiencing continuously. A frame inspection tells you what it looked like at one point in time. Second, if forager-age bees in the outward stationed posture confirm dearth onset, assess the entrance size relative to the colony's guard capacity. Not dramatically, the bees need ventilation, but reduce the entrance to what the guard force can manage reliably. The colony handles its own temperature through fanning. What it needs at the entrance in July is defense, not airflow. Third, if perimeter probing behavior is visible alongside the dearth clustering, treat the robbing pressure as a present tense problem, not a future risk to monitor. Move the entrance reducer into place that day. Fourth, and this is the step that connects the entrance observation to the winter outcome. If the observation sequence confirms dearth onset in early to mid-July, pull an alcohol wash within the following 7 to 10 days. Not because autumn treatment season has arrived, because July is when the mite count gives the most actionable information in the colony's entire annual cycle. A colony at 2% in early July, with a large active brood nest and peak adult population, may be at 4 or 5% by mid-August if the brood nest remains heavily capped. The bees carrying that August mite load into September are the bees producing the winter cohort. The winter cluster that fails in February was being assembled in July, in capped cells, out of sight, while the foragers were waiting at the entrance telling you the season had turned. The July alcohol wash, taken in response to reading the entrance correctly, is not early autumn treatment moved forward on the calendar. It is a summer intervention at the precise biological moment when the mite population's trajectory is still correctable, and when the bees being produced still have the physiological potential to become the winter cluster the colony needs. The July entrance was never about the heat. It never was. That was always the surface of it. Under the surface, the colony was doing what it always does, communicating its internal state in behavioral language it has been speaking for longer than managed beekeeping has existed. The dearth has arrived. The robbing window is open. The mites are accelerating. The autumn has begun, regardless of what the calendar says. The old commercial beekeepers in the Ohio and Indiana apiaries understood this not because they had read it in a journal, but because they had seen the outcome of reading that July entrance correctly, and of missing it, season after season, until the distinction between the two was something they felt before they could entirely explain it. The colonies whose July entrance behavior was read correctly, whose dearth onset was responded to with entrance reduction rather than ventilation, whose robbing pressure was addressed at the perimeter rather than after a colony had been robbed out, whose mite loads were assessed in the window when the information was still actionable, those colonies consistently showed better autumn populations and better winter survival. The pattern was observed long before anyone could name the mechanism. If you've ever gone into October with a colony you thought was in good shape in midsummer, only to find it struggling with reduced population and elevated mite load by the time you were ready to think about winter preparation, the morning you walked past that July entrance without reading it may be where the story actually turned, not in October, not in September. In July, at 7 in the morning, while the foragers were still accumulated on the landing board and the answer was still there to be read, the colony has been talking since before you opened it the first time. The entrance is where it starts. Most beekeepers walk past it every visit. The ones who stop for 2 minutes before the hive tool comes out are not doing anything complicated. They're just listening. If that kind of observation first, historically grounded reasoning changes how you spend 2 minutes in front of your hives this July, subscribe. There's more of this ahead. More signals, more seasonal timing, more of the knowledge the most consistent beekeepers carried in their habits long before the industry decided that products were the answer.